Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Maté. Thanks for being here. Our website is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. Coming up, we'll be speaking to historian Greg Grandin about the Trump administration's regime change war in Venezuela, which now is mired in controversy, not just because we're trying to overthrow a foreign government yet again, but also because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is in the hot seat because he presided over a blatantly unconstitutional strike, so unconstitutional that it was like doubly unconstitutional. The initial strike on one of these boats in the Caribbean, most people agree that's against the law. But to top it off, when there were survivors of the initial strike in one of these incidents, the U.S. military struck again. And Pete Hegseth claims that this is just the fog of war, nothing to see here, but it's becoming a scandal. So Greg Grandin will join us to discuss that and a whole lot more.
But before we speak to Greg, we're going to bring you our weekly segment, Friday Free for All. And for people who are free subscribers, you get a Friday Some of It. And that is in the form of a preview. And for the rest of it, subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com.
This one is just such a wacky clip. We had to play it. Hillary Clinton is still talking about the kids, the youth, who she says just don't understand their history when it comes to Israel-Palestine and keep getting brainwashed by social media. And that's why they oppose Israel in Gaza. Not say, I don't know, the images they see every single day of shredded children with U.S.-made bombs. But anyway,
right.
Let's hear from Hillary herself. Here she is.
That our students, smart, well-educated young people from our own country, from around the world, where were they getting their information? They were getting their information from social media, particularly TikTok. That is where they were learning about what happened on October 7th, what happened in the days, weeks, and months to follow. That's a serious problem. It's a serious problem for democracy, whether it's Israel or the United States, and it's a serious problem for our young people. And it was frankly shocking to me how little the students we were encountering, not only in this class we teach, which is a very large class, international relations about crisis decision making, but students more generally. And that's why I mentioned the social media piece of it, because when you would try to talk to them to engage in some kind of reasonable discussion, it was very difficult because they did not know history. They had very little context. And what they were being told on social media was not just one-sided, it was pure propaganda.
By the way, I just have to say, she really is channeling right here. If you look right here, she really looks like Dr. Evil right here.
When you think about how to tell Israel's story, and it's important, it's not just looking internally, it's looking externally, and particularly looking at young people, because, it's not just the usual suspects. It is a lot of young Jewish Americans who don't know the history and don't understand.
Thank you so much, Hillary Clinton. As a Jewish American, I'm going to thank her for goy-splaining our history to us. But a couple things to say here. This, of course, is at an event for Israel Hayom, which is a big Israeli newspaper. She is talking about her experience teaching at Columbia. And something that should be noted is that she justifiably was confronted by student protesters because she talked about, she gave a talk called Preventing and Addressing Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, where she, of course, engaged in the mass rape hoax narrative that Sheryl Sandberg, Kamala Harris all pushed, that they never corrected, even though the evidence was debunked. And of course, just to put the cherry on top of all of that is not just not correcting the lies that they spread, but failing to even mention, even pretend to care about the documented rape committed by Israelis against Palestinians. But these people are so pathetic that she thinks that you have to be brainwashed to be upset by Hillary Clinton's lies. You have to be brainwashed to be upset by images. It's not propaganda when you see Israeli soldiers themselves live streaming a genocide. That's not propaganda. That's documentary evidence.
What she's lamenting here is that people just aren't going to the traditional legacy media and getting their standard Israeli propaganda, which all the major outlets have done. And they're going on social media and deciding for themselves that, hey, I don't
Right.
like seeing images of shredded children with US made bombs. And that leads her, just as she blamed a fictional Russian interference campaign for her failure in 2016, her loss to Donald Trump, that leads her to then claim that everyone who disagrees with her on Israel are just malleable dupes being brainwashed by, fake videos and foreign propaganda. It's so condescending, her whole worldview. It's not just factually wrong and just morally wrong because she's on the side of a military genocidal occupier, but it's just so condescending towards
Right.
everybody, including her own students. Like,
Yeah.
isn't there some rule or some like code of conduct if you're teaching at an institution like Columbia, have respect for your students? But notice how she's like, and then we were talking to these kids. Oh
Yeah,
my
true.
God, they're so dumb. They don't know
Yeah.
anything. Like, you can't
Right.
even talk to them because they're so stupid. And by the way, she's talking about a class that she co-teaches with a former Israeli intelligence officer who's now the dean of SIPA, like the main foreign policy school at Columbia. So
Yeah.
because her students didn't accept her and her Israeli intelligence colleagues' Israeli propaganda, they are just dumb kids, and she's fine insulting them.
Yeah, because they know that she's lying about mass rape. So, pretending to be a feminist, pretending to care about sexual violence. And the only sexual violence she cares about is the sexual violence that was not committed. And she doesn't care about the sexual violence that actually was committed because the victims of that are Palestinian, and that doesn't serve her propaganda. I honestly don't know. Like, I'm always curious. Maybe we can do a brain scan. I'm totally clear on whether someone's fooling themselves, whether she knows the truth and she's lying, whether she's lying to herself. I don't know.
We can ask that question about many of our featured voices today, including Congressmember Maria Salazar. Now, on today's main show, we're going to have an interview with the historian Greg Grandin about many topics, including Trump's regime change campaign in Venezuela. But, we're obviously not for regime change, but Maria Salazar, Congressmember from Florida, she is. And here she is laying out the case for what.
And for the rest of our Friday Free-for-All, where we talk about Venezuela, Alex Karp of Palantir, and Stephen Miller's scary babysitting prospects, go to usefulidiots.podcast.com. Now, for our interview, we are thrilled to be speaking to Greg Grandin, who is the Peter V. and C. Van Woodward Professor of History at Yale University. He's a Pulitzer-Prize winning historian and the author of several books, including most recently, America, A New History of the New World. Welcome, Greg Grandin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So as viewers know, on September 2nd, the U.S. targeted 2 shipwrecked men who had survived an earlier U.S. strike on a boat the Pentagon says was carrying drugs without providing any evidence. We're going to be talking about that, but we're also going to be talking about propaganda. And so I thought a perfect way to start off this interview, would be by showing a clip of Martha Raddatz, and then talking about what this clip conveys, but also the way she conveys it. So, Wilson, let's play this clip of Martha Raddatz.
According to a source familiar with the incident, the 2 survivors climbed back onto the boat after the initial strike. They were believed to be potentially in communication with others and salvaging some of the drugs. Because of that, it was determined they were still in the fight and valid targets. A JAG officer was also giving legal advice.
Okay, so that's ABC's Martha Raddatz. And you tweeted out that clip and you wrote, "It's all premeditated murder. Every one of the killings, not just these 2. ABC and Raddatz are just reading propaganda." So can you expound on that and what you're referring to here?
Yeah, I can see that I spelled 2 wrong. But, well, I mean, on any number of levels, I mean, the whole thing, one is she's just repeating, what the sources in the Pentagon are saying, but she's, of course, assuming that it's an illegal operation. I mean, even if they were climbing back onto the boat, it's still premeditated murder. There's no, it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland. First the execution, then the accusation, then the trial. I mean, it's like, it's really head spinning the way that clip just took this, which is really just a series of premeditated killings, going back to the first one on September 2nd, all of them, not just the the ones that people are focusing on now of these, the so-called second tap. It's all just murder. And Radish, ABC News, it's confirming the narrative that we're at war. It's suggesting that there might be some mitigating circumstances that explains why we hit the boat twice. I mean, the whole thing should be condemned as just out and out illegal. I mean, who was it? I mean, I hate to cite George Will, but I mean, it's, Hegseth and Trump, these are war criminals without a war.
Can you walk us through a little bit what Trump is doing right now vis-a-vis Venezuela and what is motivating him?
Well, there's any number of things that are motivating him. The big picture is that for American First movement, right, that imagines the world, the United States no longer superintends a global liberal, quote unquote, political economy in which everybody plays by the rules, but the United States retreats into a kind of territorial region in which it sees its own interests. That's happened in the past, and Latin America is key to that, right? If you're gonna America First and the Monroe Doctrine have gone hand in hand together since both terms were coined. There's this sense that Latin America has to be organized, and we see it in his actions in Honduras, and actions in Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador. We can go into all of them. But then, of course, there's Venezuela and there's oil. But there are no material interests that aren't always already created by ideology. There's lots of ways to get Venezuela's oil. You can sign a bunch of contracts and get Chevron to pump the oil. It wouldn't be that big a deal. What's going on is that there was a split within the Trump administration between so-called, believe it or not, moderates. I mean, it's all relative. These are relative terms, but people like Richard Grenell, who he's an American firster, but he's very tied to Chevron, and he had negotiated a series of exemptions for Chevron to start pumping oil, which they did just a couple of weeks before the speedboat attacks. And I think those speedboat attacks was the war party, Miller, Rubio, the head of the DEA, Hegseth, attempt to preempt any normalization of relationships with Venezuela. And with Rubio, it's a kind of a confluence of two different strands. One is he's a neocon, right? Before he became an American firster, he was hot for Iran, and of course the Gulf War and everything. But he's also from South Florida. And right. He's got deep ties to the Cuban community, and Venezuela is seen as the first step towards taking out Cuba, denying it its oil, so he represents a faction of the Trump administration that sees getting Latin American organized in order as much more of an ideological project, right? Bringing a certain kind of anti-communism updated with the cultural war slop that's drowning the United States into Latin America. And so, he's doing it under the rubric of the war on drugs, which of course is not Donald Trump. That's a 50-year war. Behind right. Every single horror that Donald Trump represents exists a long train of U.S. presidents that have first put in the policies that make, what Trump does today possible. And there's nowhere clearer than that than the drug war, which started formally with Richard Nixon in 1973. So there's many things flowing into it, and you see them kind of bouncing around now and flailing around because they're not really quite sure. And certainly this overstepping with the cold-blooded murder and the joking about killing these people trying to get back on the thing has really blown back on them, because I guess even some of the hardest hardliners understand that the rules of law are there for a reason.
When Pete Hegseth was defending himself, he says that, first of all, he wasn't in the room when the follow-up strike happened on the survivors of the initial strike. He wasn't there. He also said that this was just the fog of war.
I did not personally see survivors, but I stand, because the thing was on fire. that was exploded and fire or smoke. You can't see anything. You got digital. This is called the fog of war. This is what you in the press don't understand. You sit in your air-conditioned offices or up on Capitol Hill and you nitpick and you plant fake stories.
And I'm curious, like, what, as a historian, what you thought when you heard a attempted offense in the name of the so-called fog of war.
Well, there's no war. That's the first thing. And there wasn't any fog. You could see them very clearly. So it's a metaphor fails on both counts. I think that I don't know what's driving the cruelty. I don't know what's driving the mania. Hegseth seems to be a certain kind of crazy beyond anything that I can understand. Maybe it's the drinking. Maybe it's he thinks he's in a reality show with laws of war or any kind of law applies to him. But he seems out there, beyond even some of the worst Trump people. I mean, Trump himself obviously is bad, and they take gratuitous cruelty in doing what used to be done covertly. Again, right? A lot of this stuff is a bipartisan consensus. The war on drugs, the isolation of Venezuela, the economic sanctions on Venezuela, the use of the war on drugs as a way of projecting U.S. interests. All of these things have been bipartisan policies and obviously deportations. What Trump does is that he takes them and he turns them into spectacle. And a good chunk of that is the cruelty. The U.S. drug war is what's famous about the U.S. drug war is, Trump is almost a perfect encapsulation of the catch-22 logic of the U.S. drug war. On the one hand, the CIA has in the past worked with repressive military regimes that were deeply involved in cultivating coca and cocaine production. You can go back to Pinochet, go back to the Bolivian colonels and generals in the 1970s, and you go back to Uribe under Plan Colombia. And at the same time, these very same generals are taking millions of dollars from the DEA to fight drugs. So this kind of tension between using drugs, as a kind of linchpin of an anti-communist coalition, and the profits from them to fund covert activities, right? Which Iran-Contra in the 1980s, the attempt to isolate and destabilize Sandinistas was one of the most famous examples, where tens of millions of dollars of money from the Medellin cartel went to fund the Contras, and of course the planes went back and forth carrying cocaine into the United States and carrying arms back into Honduras to give to the Contras. But so Trump in many ways represents the pure encapsulation of that. On the one hand, he's threatening to wage a war on Venezuela because of drugs. On the other hand, he's pardoning Orlando Hernandez, the former imprisoned, now free president of Honduras, who was, deeply involved in exporting cocaine into the United States. So he's, again, like with everything else, he just takes everything that the United States has been doing in the past, and he does it to an more intense degree, and he does it publicly with, and he's so in many ways he's very useful because he's revealing the dynamics that are behind it.
Well, I wanted to ask you more about that because Trump waging this regime change war against Venezuela in the name of fighting narco traffic, and then in the name of fighting narco trafficking, and then as you said, pardoning a convicted narco trafficker, the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, accepted a $1 million bribe from the drug kingpin El Chapo, bragged about stuffing the drugs up the gringos' noses. There was a man murdered in prison in a murder that was connected to his case, obviously, to the allegation there is that this man was killed because he could incriminate this former Honduran president. Talk to us more about this, and maybe start with the coup in Honduras back in 2009, and which was backed by the U.S., or at least accepted by the U.S., and how that leads us to where we are today.
Yeah, I did tweet that on Twitter that 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya is the coup that keeps giving. I mean, here we are 16 years later, and we're still living in its aftermath in many ways. I mean, Zelaya was elected president. He was a member of the Liberal Party. He wasn't thought to be a radical, but I guess he had a little bit of heart and a little bit of empathy, and he started moving to the left on quite a number of issues. And he did seem to be doing so organically, independently of what was going on elsewhere in Latin America, although elsewhere in Latin America, 2009 was around the high point of that post-Cold War return of the new left. Chavez was still in power in Venezuela, the Workers' Party in Brazil, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and so on and so forth. And Zelaya started doing things like trying to regulate the planting of African palm, which was really disruptive for peasant economies. It was poisoning the water. He tried to regulate mining. There's been a real intensification of extractivism in Central America after the signing of free trade treaties in 2008 and 2009. And Zelaya was trying to deal with some of those issues. He also kind of went off book when it came to things like abortion, where he kind of sort of made the morning after pill legal. He started to signal support for gay rights and trans rights, and what he represented in many ways was a return of the Liberal Party to its more mildly progressive roots, which the Liberal Party in the early 20th century had been moving to. It was moving towards social liberalism. And a coup in 1963, one of these post-Cuban Revolution coups that the Kennedy administration was involved in, pretty much put an end to that. And then the Liberal Party snapped back to just being a party of elites. And so Zelaya's moving in this direction was a return, in many ways, a natural evolution that had been interrupted with the coup in 1963. So then one of the things that he wanted to do was have a referendum. He wasn't even trying to change the Constitution to run for a second term, which is forbidden in the Constitution. He just held a referendum to ask Hondurans if they wanted to change the Constitution at some point in the future after his term was up. So he wouldn't even extend his term. And, basically all of the different things that he had done galvanized, activated all of the old Cold War right, anti-communist right, and also, a new right concerned with things like the advancement of sexual rights for women. And they overthrew him. And there was it was the creation of a social movement, and that eventually became the Liberal Party. That his wife, he was driven out of the country, and he was constantly trying to come back. And the Obama administration at first kind of didn't seem to be involved. It seemed much more like people like Otto Reich and these other kind of private vectors that push right-wing policies in Latin America were very active in Honduras. It didn't seem... And
Otto Reich, just to clarify, Otto Reich being a former Reagan administration official, heavily involved in the dirty wars.
Yeah, former Reagan administrator during Iran-Contra. He was the head of the Office of Public Diplomacy. He was down in Honduras, and Otto Reich was, and then of course George W. Bush tried to nominate him for something, but I think he was too controversial even for that. So the coup dragged on. There was no resolution, and eventually Hillary Clinton's State Department, not eventually, fairly quickly soon, came up with a solution, to that for the coup, which basically ratified the coup. So whether the U.S. government was actually involved is a question. There were certainly sectors from the United States, that were involved, deeply involved, and before long, Hillary Clinton and the State Department were isolating Zelaya and imagining some solution. It led to the election of an interim president that eventually led to the election of Orlando Hernandez. And of course, the irony is, Zelaya was overthrown for trying to have a referendum to ask the question if they wanted to have two-term elections, and Orlando Hernandez actually did run a second time and became president and was reelected. And the other thing that goes on with all of this is Honduras is singled out by a lot of these crypto ideologues from Silicon Valley as a place in which they could create year zero cities where they could begin again anew, free of all of the encumbrances of taxes and regulations. And Zelaya was threatening that, and that moved forward under Hernandez. And there's one island, there's one place, Prospera, that people like Milton Friedman's grandson was involved. The whole kind of raft of cranks that just want to start over out on the ocean or somewhere, and they see Honduras as the place to make that happen. And Castro, Zelaya's wife, was elected 4 years ago president. And the reason why she was elected is that they made a tentative alliance with the Liberal Party, the forces that grouped around her, the social movement forces, Libre, made an alliance, worked together electorally with the for the presidential elections. There was a Liberal Party candidate, but she got enough votes where she won the presidency. And she's had a mixed presidency. Honduras is one of these countries. It's a poor peripheral country in Central America in which being president doesn't mean you have a hell of a lot of power. But I guess even the minor things that she tried to do, like make schools free again, which was revoked after the 2009 coup, was too much of a threat. And the real threat was that she was going after these free year zero cities, and she so I don't know where that's going to land, but as she was in power, obviously the forces of the National Party and Orlando Hernandez were regrouping. So that's the larger context. So it's an interesting moment how that coup just keeps on having, has long legs.
And what do you think Trump is trying to do in Venezuela, and will he succeed?
Well, I think that I don't know what he's doing in Venezuela, because I think it does seem that,
I guess, speaking of coups and regime change, yeah.
Obviously, Marco Rubio wants. The momentum to get Maduro out is quite strong and surprisingly orchestrated, seemingly, which included the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, because they put Machado, they gave her the prize, and she immediately fulfilled her role as everybody's worst expectation of what could possibly happen. Can you imagine? No, I can't imagine any other Peace Prize winner immediately embarking on an alliance with Donald Trump to stage a coup. But that's where we are. I mean, I think that Trump wants Venezuela settled, and what that means is two different versions. One, it means Maduro's gone, and some provisional government favorable to the United States is in power, or it means the Richard Grenell and these other people who are linked to the Chevron faction within the Trump administration. That it means that Maduro could be there. It just some semblance of normalcy is established, and the oil is pumping. By the way, through all of this, the oil still comes out of Venezuela and goes to Port Arthur thanks to those variances that Grenell managed to achieve right before the speedboat killings. And now deportation flights have restarted after being halted for a little while. That's why I'm a little bit dubious about whether Trump is going to go all in on Rubio's vision. I think there's a lot of reasons not to, because it doesn't have enormous support in the United States. It doesn't have support on the MAGA base. I mean, on one level, it would be a distraction and it would be, helpful. On the other level, and obviously Hegseth is having all of these problems, which I don't have access to within the military itself, right? Just the leaking of that footage and all of the stuff that has led to the controversy of that double tap killing of that last speedboat suggests there's deep discontent within the military. Now the story is out that he has had, he was in a long drawn out fight with who was the head of Southcom, the Pentagon branch, which deals with everything below Mexico and the Caribbean, to the point where he was, asked to resign, and he did resign. So it seems to be that the military is a mess, and I don't really know how the military operates. I don't know how much of a mess you could be and still wage an effective bombing campaign of Venezuela. Venezuela's not Libya. I don't think the result would be. I mean, it's effective for us to continue saying it's like Libya because, Libya was such a catastrophe, what the United States and NATO did there. People are, I think things are tough in Venezuela. I believe in the principle of sovereignty. I think the Venezuelans should sort it out themselves. But I think that, there are sectors of the population that are, including sectors of the popular movement, that maybe feel a little bit long betrayed by Maduro.
I wanted you to respond to something that Marco Rubio said about Venezuela in a discussion with Sean Hannity.
The Venezuelan regime is a source of instability in the entire region. Over 8 million Venezuelans have flooded into neighboring countries as a result of the regime's activities within their own country, including into the United States. They also happen to be the foothold of Iran. That's not spoken about enough. Iran, its IRGC, and even Hezbollah has a presence in South America, and one of their anchor presence, especially for the Iranians, is inside of Venezuela.
So talk to us about this Hezbollah foothold in Venezuela.
So this is...
And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiotspodcast.com.
And thanks again to Greg Grandin. If you're not a paid subscriber and you want access to the full interview where we talk about things like the latest efforts to justify regime change in Venezuela, including by claiming that Hamas is somehow implicated in Venezuela these days via a secret uranium enrichment scheme. It's a doozy. Plus also Marco Rubio weighing in. And how can we blame the Clintons for everything? Well, go to our website, usefulidiotspodcast.com, for that bonus content with Greg Grandin.
Thanks, guys. You won't regret it. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.